Sid Vicious, famous worldwide, labeled the most dangerous face of punk rock. In a single night, Sid Vicious woke up in a Chelsea hotel room beside the body of Nancy Spungen, age 20, her blood already dry, a knife lying nearby. No screaming, no panic, no memory. The amount of heroin in his system was enough to erase the final waking hours of a human mind. When police asked what he had done, Sid didn't defend himself, didn't deny anything. He said only one sentence: "I don't remember anything." But if a person no longer remembers who they became that night, can they carry a guilt they are not even sure they committed? Before the police report, before the headlines, before the courtroom that never happened, Sid Vicious had already been judged. By 1977, he wasn't famous for his music. He was famous for the way he looked like danger, safety pins through skin, vacant eyes, a body that seemed permanently on the edge of collapse. The press didn't describe his songs, they described his behavior. Violence, heroin, chaos. Every photograph reinforced the same idea. This was a man capable of losing control. So when Nancy Spungen died, the story didn't need evidence. It already had a character. Sid had been arrested before. He had hurt himself on stage. He had frightened people without trying. He fit the role perfectly. And in a culture that consumes stories faster than truth, fitting the role is often enough. What made it darker was this: Sid didn't fight back. He didn't launch a campaign to clear his name. He didn't give impassioned interviews. He barely spoke at all, as if the version of himself the world believed in had already replaced the real one. And somewhere between addiction, blackout, and silence, even Sid seemed unsure which version was real. When a man is famous for being dangerous, does the truth still matter when something terrible happens? Or does the image finish the story long before the facts ever get a chance? Long before the knife, before the hotel room, before the headlines, Sid Vicious learned how to disappear. He was born in 1957 into instability that never really paused long enough to be called a childhood. His mother struggled with heroin addiction, moving from place to place, relationship to relationship, rarely offering the one thing a child needs most: consistency. There was no stable home, no predictable routine, no adult presence capable of absorbing fear and returning safety. Chaos wasn't a phase, it was the baseline. By the time Sid was old enough to understand the world around him, drugs were already part of the environment, not hidden, not whispered about. They existed openly, casually, like furniture in the room. Addiction wasn't something that destroyed life later, it framed life from the beginning. And when drugs shape a household, memory becomes unreliable long before substances ever touch the bloodstream. Sid learned early that emotions were dangerous. Attachment led to disappointment, dependence led to loss. So he adapted the only way a child in that environment can, by numbing, withdrawing, and accepting absence as normal. He didn't learn how to regulate fear or anger. He learned how to endure them silently. This is where the pattern begins to matter. Blackouts didn't start in adulthood. Dissociation didn't arrive with heroin. Long before substances amplified it, Sid already lived in fragments. Moments blurred together, days lost shape. When things became overwhelming, his mind learned how to step away. Forgetting wasn't failure, it was survival. As a teenager, Sid drifted through London's underground culture, not as a rebel with a cause, but as someone searching for belonging that didn't require stability. Punk didn't demand emotional health. It didn't ask for discipline or patience. It asked only for presence, noise, attitude, defiance. And for someone who had never been taught how to build a future, rebellion felt safer than hope. There was also something else punk offered that Sid had never experienced before: identity without responsibility. You didn't have to explain yourself. You didn't have to be consistent. You didn't have to remember who you were yesterday. You just had to be loud enough today. People around him noticed how easily Sid slipped into extreme states. Rage followed by emptiness. Energy followed by collapse. He didn't moderate. He swung. And when drugs entered the picture more heavily, they didn't create the instability. They simply removed what little friction remained. This matters because when later events are reduced to simple explanations, he was violent, he was addicted, he was reckless, something essential gets lost. Sid wasn't someone who gradually lost control. He never learned how to hold it. By the time fame arrived, his psychological foundation was already cracked. Not dramatically, quietly, invisibly, the kind of damage that doesn't scream until it's too late. So when Sid would later say, "I don't remember anything," it wasn't just a legal problem, it was a lifelong condition intensified by chemicals. Memory, for him, had always been optional. Presence had always been temporary. And that raises the question no investigation ever truly asked. If someone grows up learning how to disappear inside their own mind, how do we judge what happens in the moments they cannot remember at all? Sid Vicious didn't enter punk rock with ambition. He entered it the way someone steps into fog not to be seen but to disappear inside it. By the mid-1970s, London's underground scene wasn't just a musical movement, it was a refuge for people who didn't fit anywhere else. Punk didn't ask where you came from. It didn't ask what you planned to become. It only asked whether you could stand there and mean it. For Sid, that was enough. Presence mattered more than skill. Attitude mattered more than control. He wasn't chasing a career. He was looking for permission to exist without explanation. People around him noticed early on that Sid wasn't a craftsman. He didn't practice obsessively. He didn't refine technique. What he had instead was an intensity that made others uneasy. A look that suggested he was already halfway past the point of caring what happened next. In a culture that valued provocation, that made him valuable. When Sid was pulled into the orbit of the Sex Pistols, it wasn't because of what he could do, it was because of what he represented. The band didn't need another musician, they needed a symbol. Someone who looked like the end of the road. Someone who embodied the chaos punk claimed to celebrate. And Sid fit perfectly. This was the moment where identity stopped being something he searched for and became something assigned to him. The leather jacket, the safety pins, the vacant stare. These weren't costumes he wore temporarily. They became expectations. Once the image locked in, deviation wasn't allowed. Growth wasn't encouraged. Stability wasn't interesting. What mattered was consistency of collapse. Inside this world, responsibility blurred. Violence wasn't corrected, it was aestheticized. Addiction wasn't treated as danger, it was treated as authenticity. The more Sid unraveled, the more real he appeared. And no one stepped in to ask whether the person underneath could survive the role he was being handed. This was not liberation, it was a narrowing of options. Sid learned quickly that being reckless brought attention, and attention brought belonging. He didn't have to explain mood swings. He didn't have to manage impulses. Everything could be blamed on the movement, the music, the moment. Punk didn't demand accountability, it rewarded intensity. And for someone who had never been taught how to regulate emotion, that was intoxicating. As the scene grew louder and the stakes higher, Sid's internal compass weakened further. Decisions weren't weighed, consequences weren't anticipated. Everything happened in the now. And when the now became unbearable, drugs provided a way to disappear without leaving. This path felt like freedom because it removed choice. There was no future to plan for, no version of adulthood to imagine. Just the next night, the next crowd, the next chemical escape. What no one acknowledged was that this path had no exit. Sid wasn't building a life. He was being shaped into a spectacle. And the deeper he leaned into it, the harder it became to tell where his personality ended and the image began. By the time fame approached, Sid no longer stood at the edge of chaos. He lived inside it. And once chaos becomes home, the line between control and catastrophe starts to disappear. So when the world later looked at Sid and assumed he was capable of anything, was that judgment formed by evidence, or by years of watching him be trained not to resist the worst version of himself? Fame didn't arrive quietly for Sid Vicious. It exploded around him. By 1977, punk rock had crossed the line from underground noise to international spectacle. The Sex Pistols weren't just a band anymore. They were a cultural emergency. Television bans, canceled shows, public outrage, every rejection only amplified the signal. And at the center of that signal was Sid, frozen into an image the world couldn't look away from. He wasn't the best musician on stage. Often, he wasn't even the most audible, but he was the most visible. Cameras loved him, headlines needed him. He looked like the physical embodiment of everything the establishment feared. Reckless, unpredictable, unmanageable. In photographs, he didn't perform rebellion. He appeared to live inside it. The industry noticed. Sid became the face people remembered when they forgot the songs. His image traveled faster than the music. Magazine covers, tabloids, grainy concert footage replayed again and again. Each frame reinforced the same story. This is what danger looks like when it smiles back at you. And with visibility came permission. On stage, Sid hurt himself, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not. Blood became part of the performance. Instead of stopping shows, crowds cheered louder. What should have triggered concern was interpreted as authenticity. The more he unraveled, the more real he was said to be. Pain wasn't a warning sign, it was branding. Drugs followed the same logic. Heroin wasn't hidden, it was mythologized. Stories of excess circulated like proof of credibility. Survival was never the metric. Commitment to the image was. What made this phase so dangerous wasn't just the chaos, it was the applause that surrounded it. Sid learned that when he crossed lines, attention multiplied. When he lost control, he became unforgettable. Stability, by contrast, made him invisible. And invisibility had always been his greatest fear. Inside the noise, Sid's inner world grew quieter. Fame doesn't strengthen identity when there isn't one to begin with. It replaces it. Decisions started being made for him. Schedules, appearances, expectations. The image had momentum now, and it needed feeding. There were moments when people around him sensed the collapse coming. Moments when it was clear he was exhausted, overwhelmed, chemically dependent beyond control. But intervention threatened the product. And the product was working. So no one pressed pause. Sid didn't experience fame as achievement. He experienced it as acceleration. Everything moved faster than his ability to process. Nights blurred together. Cities changed without leaving impressions. Memory gaps widened. The person underneath the image shrank. By the time the world labeled him a legend, Sid was barely holding himself together. And here lies the cruelest paradox of his peak. The version of Sid that the world loved most was the version least capable of surviving what came next. If fame rewards the performance of self-destruction, what happens when the performer can no longer tell where the performance ends and the damage begins? By the time fame stopped feeling new, Sid Vicious had already crossed into dependence that no longer needed celebration. Heroin wasn't a habit anymore, it was a requirement. Days began with it. Nights dissolved into it. The drug didn't make him reckless, it made him absent. And absence is far more dangerous than rage. Blackouts became routine. Not dramatic collapses, but quiet erasures. Hours vanished. Conversations disappeared. Decisions were made by a version of Sid that would never be remembered by the version who woke up afterward. People around him started filling in the gaps for him. You said this, you did that. You don't remember? Of course you don't. Memory loss wasn't treated as an emergency. It was normalized, even joked about. In a culture that celebrated excess, forgetting was framed as part of the mythology. But forgetting meant there was no internal record, no moral ledger. Consequences arrived without context. This is where Nancy Spungen becomes impossible to separate from Sid's collapse. Their relationship was not built on balance or care. It was built on synchronization. Same substances, same rhythms, same withdrawals. When one fell, the other followed. They didn't regulate each other, they amplified. Isolation tightened around them as friends, bandmates, and handlers began to pull away. Not because they didn't care, but because intervention had failed too many times already. Arguments escalated quickly. So did reconciliations. Violence existed in the relationship, but so did desperation. They were bound together less by love than by the shared fear of being alone while unraveling. Drugs became the only language that never demanded clarity. As Sid's dependence deepened, so did his passivity. He stopped asserting preferences. stopped making plans, stopped imagining outcomes. Life shrank to the immediate, the next fix, the next room, the next moment of silence. When chaos happened around him, it no longer registered as abnormal. It felt expected. What made this phase especially dangerous was how invisible the collapse became. Sid didn't scream for help. He didn't threaten to quit. He didn't dramatize his pain. He simply drifted further into chemical stillness, and stillness, when mistaken for calm, goes unnoticed. People later described him as unpredictable, but unpredictability implies sudden change. Sid's condition was steady, consistently impaired, consistently disconnected. He wasn't spiraling wildly. He was sinking slowly. Nancy had conflicts with others, money disputes, tensions, arguments that spilled beyond the couple. People came and went, rooms filled and emptied. The environment around them was porous. Yet no one kept track. No one documented who was present, who left, or when boundaries dissolved. The assumption was simple: nothing mattered enough to remember. And that assumption would become catastrophic. Because when the worst thing imaginable finally happened, it didn't arrive as a dramatic rupture. It arrived into a system already stripped of witnesses, memory, and accountability. If a person spends years living in blackout, surrounded by chaos that no one monitors, at what point does responsibility become indistinguishable from circumstance? The night of the 12th of October, 1978 did not announce itself as a turning point. It arrived quietly, already blurred before it began. The room at the Chelsea Hotel wasn't sealed. People came and went. Conversations overlapped. Substances circulated freely. No one marked time. No one marked exits. Memory, already unreliable, was chemically dismantled hour by hour. By the time silence settled in, there was no clean timeline left to reconstruct. Sometime during that night, Nancy Spungen was stabbed once in the abdomen. Not multiple wounds, not a frenzy. One fatal injury. When her body was discovered hours later, blood had already dried. There were no signs of forced entry, no confirmed struggle, no witnesses who could place themselves clearly inside the room at the critical moment. And then there was Sid. His blood was saturated with heroin, enough according to medical assessments to induce a prolonged blackout. Not unconsciousness, but absence. A state where actions can occur without forming memory. When police questioned him, he didn't construct a defense. He didn't deny involvement. He didn't explain. He repeated the same sentence again and again: "I don't remember anything." That statement would define everything that followed. Investigators faced a vacuum. The weapon belonged to Sid. The room was registered to him. He was the only person definitively present when Nancy died. And yet, none of that answered the central question. Possession is not action. Presence is not intent. Memory loss is not proof. Several possibilities existed, and none could be eliminated. There was the most obvious one. Sid, in a state of intoxicated blackout, inflicted the wound without conscious awareness. No rage remembered, no motive recalled, just a moment lost to chemicals. There was another, an accident, a chaotic environment, impaired coordination, a movement without intention that resulted in irreversible damage. And then there was the possibility no one wanted to pursue seriously, a third presence, someone who entered and left unnoticed, someone whose interaction with Nancy escalated beyond control. In a scene defined by transience, that possibility could not be disproven, only ignored. The investigation didn't have the luxury of patience. The story had already taken shape in the public imagination. Sid Vicious was dangerous. Sid Vicious was violent. Sid Vicious was addicted. The narrative didn't need resolution. It needed confirmation. What never happened was a full reconstruction of the night. No comprehensive timeline, no definitive forensic clarity, no answers strong enough to survive scrutiny. Instead, there were fragments, assumptions, headlines that hardened before facts could. And Sid himself became the most unreliable witness of all. Without memory, he couldn't argue innocence convincingly. Without clarity, he couldn't accept guilt fully. He existed in a limbo where even he didn't know which version of events he occupied. The man accused of killing Nancy could not confirm or deny the accusation, not because he refused to, but because his mind offered nothing to work with. In the end, the legal process never reached its conclusion. The questions remained open. The night remained unsealed. And what lingered was something far more unsettling than a verdict. If no one can remember what happened, no one can prove what happened, and the person at the center isn't even certain of himself, does truth still exist, or does it dissolve into the story that feels most believable? After the night at the Chelsea Hotel, time did not move forward for Sid Vicious. It folded inward. He was released on bail, but freedom did not feel like release. Nancy was gone. The band was fractured. The image that once carried him had turned into an accusation he could not escape. Wherever he went, the question followed, not spoken but present. People didn't ask what happened. They assumed they already knew. This should have been the moment of confrontation, the moment to fight, to reconstruct, to insist on truth. Instead, Sid retreated. Not dramatically, quietly. He drifted through days without structure, without direction, without a narrative strong enough to replace the one already written for him. What made this period so strange was that, on paper, it looked like survival. He wasn't in jail, he wasn't on stage bleeding, he wasn't screaming into microphones or provoking headlines. From the outside, it appeared as if the storm had passed. Inside, it had simply gone silent. Sid had lost the only person who shared his rhythms, the only witness to his days. Without Nancy, the routine collapsed, and without routine, the emptiness became unbearable. He did not process grief the way people expect. There were no long confessions, no moments of clarity. Grief arrived as numbness, as stillness, as the absence of desire to explain anything at all. This was the narrow opening where something like rebirth could have occurred. Friends and handlers talked about rehab, about stepping away, about resetting. There were brief moments when it seemed possible. Moments when Sid spoke softly, when the chaos paused long enough to imagine a version of life not governed by addiction or spectacle. But imagination requires a future, and Sid had never been taught how to picture one. The weight of uncertainty pressed constantly. Not knowing what had happened that night didn't free him, it trapped him. Because how do you move on from something you cannot confirm or deny? How do you forgive yourself without knowing what you're forgiving? Sid did not claim innocence with conviction. He did not accept guilt either. He existed in a space between, where both options felt dishonest. That limbo eroded any remaining sense of identity. If the world believed he was a killer, and he could not prove otherwise, not even to himself, then what was left to defend? Drugs filled that gap efficiently. Heroin offered what clarity could not: silence. It did not resolve questions, it erased them. Each use flattened time further, turning days into indistinguishable stretches where the past no longer demanded answers. In a cruel way, it was the only form of peace Sid had ever known. There were no grand plans during this period, no comeback strategy, no reinvention. The idea of rebirth existed only as a possibility others projected onto him. For Sid, it felt abstract, unreal, like a language he never learned how to speak. And yet, the tragedy of this phase is not that Sid refused help, it's that help arrived without a foundation, without memory, without a stable self to rebuild. Recovery assumes there is something intact beneath the damage. Sid was no longer certain there was. In public, the myth hardened. In private, the man thinned. The turning point was there, but it did not turn the way people expected. It bent inward, away from resolution, away from redemption, toward disappearance. If rebirth requires belief in a future self, what happens when someone cannot remember the past clearly enough to believe they deserve one? There was very little after left for Sid Vicious. Once released on bail, Sid moved through the world like someone already half gone. The attention didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It no longer came as fascination or provocation. It arrived as judgment, as suspicion, as silence that followed him into every room. People watched him carefully, not to understand, but to confirm what they already believed. Without a trial, without a verdict, the story froze in place. Legally unresolved, emotionally sealed. The absence of closure didn't create space for healing, it created a permanent echo. Every interaction was haunted by the same unspoken question. Sid didn't answer it. He didn't know how. Attempts were made to stabilize him. Short stays, conversations about treatment, vague plans about stepping away from the scene. But these efforts lacked urgency because there was no crisis visible enough to force action. Sid wasn't overdosing publicly. He wasn't committing new acts of violence. He was simply dissolving. Heroin remained constant. It didn't excite him anymore. It muted him. It flattened days into something tolerable. In a world that demanded explanation, drugs offered erasure. And erasure felt safer than interpretation. On the 2nd of February, 1979, less than 4 months after Nancy's death, Sid was found dead from a heroin overdose. He was 21 years old. There was no dramatic buildup, no final statement, no definitive intention, just another disappearance, the same way he had learned to cope as a child, quietly, completely. What followed was immediate myth-making. Sid Vicious became eternal the moment he stopped breathing. The unresolved case fused with his image. Punk froze him in time as the ultimate symbol of self-destruction. Posters, documentaries, album art, each version more confident than the last. Each version more certain about who Sid was and what he represented. Very few of those versions left room for uncertainty. Nancy Spungen became a footnote, a mystery, a tragedy referenced but rarely explored. The question of what truly happened that night at the Chelsea Hotel was absorbed into the larger narrative of how Punk ends. Ambiguity became inconvenient. Certainty sold better. What disappeared in this process was the human scale of the story. Sid was not remembered as someone who grew up without stability, not as someone whose memory fractured under pressure long before fame arrived. Not as someone whose addictions removed his ability to testify on his own behalf. He was remembered as an image, a warning, a caricature of collapse. Legacy has a way of simplifying pain. In death, Sid finally achieved the clarity he never had in life. The world decided who he was, what he did, what his story meant, and the messiness that made truth difficult was edited out. What remains is a legacy built on unanswered questions, a cultural symbol shaped more by projection than evidence, a life reduced to a single night that even the person at its center could not remember. And that leaves us with something deeply uncomfortable. If a person dies before their story is resolved, who owns the truth that remains? There was never a verdict in the story of Sid Vicious. No courtroom decision, no final reconstruction of the night at the Chelsea Hotel. What remained instead was something far less comfortable: uncertainty. Sid may have killed Nancy Spungen. He may not have. The truth is that no one can say with absolute certainty what happened in that room. Not the police, not the press, not even Sid himself. And that absence of clarity has been filled, over time, with assumption. What's easier to accept is the image, the dangerous punk, the self-destructive icon, the story that fits too neatly to question. But images don't testify. They don't remember. They don't suffer consequences. People do. Sid lived a life shaped by instability long before fame arrived. By the time the world demanded answers from him, his memory was already fractured, his sense of self already eroded. Expecting clarity from someone who had spent years disappearing inside himself was never realistic. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story isn't the possibility of guilt. It's the possibility that the truth was never the priority. That once the image aligned with the tragedy, certainty became optional. Sid Vicious didn't die knowing what really happened that night, and the world didn't wait for him to find out. When a life ends before the truth can surface, what we're left with isn't justice or closure, but a mirror, reflecting how quickly we choose stories over understanding.